This country is safe against Superman, thanks to you.
No, sir. Don't thank me, Warden. We're all part of the same team.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy. Superman the movie and Man of Steel are very similar movies, but I think there is one very similar scene in each movie that shows us why one film is like this.
Woo! Let's party! Let's dance!
And the other one is more like this.
Crying helps me slow down and obsess over the weight of life's problems.
Now, I want to talk about these films because I think they're more than just superhero movies. These movies are both very important to our culture and can tell us a lot about ourselves. But first I'm going to go through the movie's many similarities, and there are a lot of them because Man of Steel is essentially a remake of Superman the movie, with both films drawing from the Superman mythos that has been built up over the past 90 years. Each movie begins on Krypton with Jor-El sentencing General Zod and his followers to the Phantom Zone, and they swear revenge. Jor-El and Lara place Kal-El in his rocket ship and send him to Earth, where we then see him grow up as a youngster, learning to cope with his superpowers and integrate into human society. When he discovers his true heritage, he questions his place in the world and gets a pep talk from his Earth dad about why he should hide his powers. His Earth dad dies, sending young Clark on a mission to the North, where he eventually discovers a relic of Krypton. There, his true heritage is revealed by a computer image of his Kryptonian father. And in each movie, Kal-El's first question is about himself.
Who am I?
That's my name.
Afterwards, he flies for the first time in his supersuit, and then he sorts out his life as Clark Kent before the focus shifts to the villain. The first person Superman saves is intrepid reporter Lois Lane. Superman reveals himself to the public, and the world has to suddenly grapple with the idea that there is a Superman among them. The villain causes widespread disasters and briefly incapacitates Superman with relics from Krypton. But soon he leaps into action, but learns that his awesome powers are not enough to keep everyone alive. He is forced to kill Zod, and he cannot save Lois Lane. Afterwards, the hero screams, which, yes, Superman then reverses the rotation of the Earth and saves Lois, creating a weird time paradox. It was the 1970s. We didn't have to take everything so seriously back then. Now, before I get too far into these movies, I gotta say, Superman's my favorite superhero. Superman the movie is my favorite superhero movie. I love this character, and there are a few common misconceptions about Superman that we have to set straight because I feel like he's been missing from the zeitgeist for a few decades now. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two New Deal idealists, and he was created to be a hero of the common man. In his first appearance, he goes after a slumlord, roughs up a wife beater, and saves a man from wrongful execution. In the book, Superman, the unauthorized biography, Glenn Weldon says there are two traits that define Superman. He puts the needs of others ahead of himself, and he never gives up. Siegel and Shuster were second-generation Jewish immigrants, and Superman is a reflection of their families' histories. Their families fled anti-Semitism in Europe, and in the first panel of Action Comics #1, we see the Holocaust of Krypton. Superman, like many immigrants, changes his name from the old country, and when he looks around his adopted home, he is filled with wonder and gratitude.
I just wish you could all see the Earth the way that I see it. Because when you really look at it, it's just one world.
This ideal was a product of a simpler time, the pastoral Americana of the 1930s New Deal era. As we'll talk about later, Superman did not represent America as it was, but America as we wished it could be. Superman resonates with us because, and I know this is cliche to say, but it's true, Superman is our modern myth. His origin story, a marriage of the heavens and the earth to create a Superman, is as old as Hercules, Achilles, Jesus, or 100 other myths about God sending a special human to walk among us.
Timber. His arms wide.
But instead of holding his godhood over our heads, Superman chooses to serve. Now, I do think that Superman is not exactly in step with America right now because we are a people who have become increasingly self-serving. Apply whatever politics you want to that, I guess. I will say, though, that rather than having like shared media we watch together, the entertainment we consume is increasingly micro-targeted to us as individuals. Whether it's a TikTok or a YouTube video or your like cable news preference, we are increasingly isolated into smaller groups and we see one another as the other. And this fracturing was beginning in the 20th century, at least in the 1960s and 70s. Riots, bombings, wars, gas hikes, stagflation, unemployment, assassinations, and constant arguments around the dinner table.
I don't want nobody to touch no food here till I get an explanation of this.
And this was the America that Superman found in 1978 when his first movie was released. He was a hero that we could all get behind, a man who simply wanted to help because it was the right thing to do, a man who would never give up. So, let's talk about Superman 78. The movie is essentially in 4 chapters. This Shakespearean Kryptonian chapter is frankly a little boring. And then we have the Norman Rockefeller-esque childhood of Clark Kent, followed by the comic strip life of Superman and Metropolis. The 4th chapter is the tragic 1970s disaster movie, where Christopher Reeve gets to really show off his Juilliard training. The movie also created the template for the modern superhero movie that films like Iron Man or Spider-Man would replicate for decades. Prologue, origin, powers, villain, climax. Now, earlier when I said we were going to talk about one similar scene in each movie, I lied. I'm going to talk about 4 different scenes in each movie that provide the character building blocks for 2 very different Supermen. So let's start with Superman 78. Director Richard Donner had a single rule that applied to all corners of production: verisimilitude. What's that mean? Verisimilitude means the appearance of being true or real. He did not want to create a cartoon camp film like Batman the movie. He wanted to create a Superman that was more man than super, someone the audience could relate to, and then he wanted this person to interact with a world that felt like our own. Donner wanted audiences to see themselves and their country on screen. Now this is a huge departure from other children's films of the era. The idea of taking superheroes seriously had been around in the comics for decades, but TV and movies still treated heroes like camp.
Yeah, I'll be a sidewinding gopher. Whatever that is. Well, Jimmy, now you can get out of here.
So, it was important for Donner to create a realistic childhood for Clark in Smallville. This is a version of the character that was never Superboy like he was in the comics. He was a real teenager with real problems. He can't use his powers to be a popular football hero. Instead, he's the water boy that gets teased and never gets the girl.
Ken can't make it. They got a lot of work to do.
What are you talking about? I just finished stacking all
that?
Oh.
This frustration boils over when he shows off his powers when no one is looking. And later on, his dad gives him this sage advice.
You are here for a reason. I do know one thing. It's not to score touchdowns.
He's telling his son that there's more to life than high school. He's telling him that someday he's going to have to leave childish things behind. But also, he's telling Clark that his gifts create an obligation. He owes the world a debt that he has to pay back. For America in 1978, this was a welcome return to simpler times. In case you don't know, like a wave of 50s nostalgia swept through 1970s culture, beginning with American Graffiti and really kind of crescendoing with Grease. Now, Paul Kent is speaking as the voice of New Deal America, an America that beat the Great Depression, won the war, and rebuilt Europe. This is an America that believes that its great power and wealth meant that it owed something to the rest of the world. Now, I should note that this is an idealized version of America that is not real. Our country has an abysmal track record on civil rights, human rights, economic disparity, labor clashes, riots, but America continuously improved because we aspire to be better. So Paul Kent is describing an America that is an ideal. It's how we want to see ourselves, and it's who we once aspired to be. Now, this America is not real, but neither is Superman. But he exists as an ideal for us to strive toward. Not to be a person with superpowers, but to be a person who always puts the needs of others ahead of ourselves. A person who never gives up. And of course, moments later, Paul Kent dies, showing Clark the fragility of life and that there are some people he just will not be able to save. This reinforces to him that he has to find out who he is and help people while he still can. Which brings us to the second scene, when he meets a program of his birth father, Jor-El, played by a Marlon Brando who didn't even learn to pronounce the word Krypton.
You are the only survivor of the planet Krypton.
Clark has to journey to the top of the world, to Mount Olympus, to meet his father, who is like a god. What do you mean by that? Well, Jor-El is a being with the knowledge of 24 galaxies who has survived death. I'd say that's pretty godlike. He tells him,
even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them.
Clark then leaves his physical body for 12 years, while his father expands his consciousness to assimilate knowledge from the Kryptonian database.
Knowledge is power.
So, this is where I should note that Superman was created by 2 Jewish men, and especially in the early days, he largely served as a Jewish allegory. For instance, his rocket was inspired by the basket that carried Moses down the River Nile. But once Superman hit the mainstream, Christians started to relate to the story as well. The idea of Jor-El sending a perfect Superman to Earth to save us from ourselves mirrored the story of Christ, and Mario Puzo's script even had Jor-El paraphrase John 3:16 when he says the people of Earth can be great.
I have sent them you, my only son.
Now, don't be angry that this Jewish myth became a Christian myth, because this is the function of myth. Different cultures relate to the heroes, and then we add our own culture to the story. So this scene is essentially Clark's ascension into a kind of godhood. It's when he understands his powers and his place in the universe. After this, he is Superman, and he flies for the first time, which takes us into our key scene of Superman 78, when he reveals himself to the world in the sequence where he saves Lois Lane from a helicopter crash. I'll admit, compared to the big flashy CGI spectacles of today, this sequence seems almost rudimentary. A news helicopter malfunctions on a roof, and Lois ends up hanging on by a thread. Now, it's important that this entire sequence plays out very realistically. Remember, verisimilitude. We need to really think that Lois Lane is screwed here, like this lady is going to die. So that means that when she falls, the moment when Superman catches her is just magical. What the hell is that?
Easy, miss.
The filmmakers famously spent months working out exactly how to sell this image because Superman flying looks so fake in the TV show. They even tried shooting dummies out of cannons at one point. But Christopher Reeve sells the illusion of flight so effortlessly. He was actually a pilot who understood the small nudges that would guide an aircraft in different directions. Like, I still watch him fly and think, that looks real. I mean, that's the tagline of the movie. You'll believe a man can fly. But the subtext of that slogan is, you will believe in Superman, and you will believe in what Superman represents. Margot Kidder is also so manic in this scene, while Superman is so suave and calm.
I've got you.
You've got me! Who's got you?
And when the helicopter falls, Superman gets to display his other power, super strength. And guys, we see Superman do super things an hour and 10 minutes into the movie, and it's been worth the wait. Afterwards, he's able to tell her who he is with just 2 words.
A friend.
And then he flies off to stop crime, save lives, and get a cat out of a tree. This is a hero who could do anything, but he chooses to be of service. He chooses to help a little girl reunite with her cat. So this setup makes it even more heartbreaking when Superman fails. And this is the 4th and final scene that I want to talk about, Superman's failure. In the movie, Lex Luthor uses nuclear missiles to create earthquakes that are going to break California off into the Pacific Ocean. Now, he knows this will kill millions of people, but then his worthless desert land will become beachfront property. At the beginning of the movie's 3rd act, Superman is still shaking off the effects of kryptonite while he's chasing down this missile. Now, throughout the movie, Donner has established Superman as a kind of invincible god. He transcended his human form to learn astronomy with Marlon Brando. He effortlessly stops criminals and wins Lois's heart. But this is the first time since he's put on the tights that we really see him struggle. He stops the first missile, but even Superman can't be in 2 places at once. The second missile detonates, causing earthquakes across the state. Superman then uses his godlike powers to dive into the earth and to stop the earthquake, followed by mighty feats, saving a train, redirecting the Colorado River. But while he's doing all of this, Lois is caught in the earthquake, being pulled underground. So Superman's most heroic achievement is intercut with this slow, brutal suffering of Lois Lane. When we watch Superman save this town, it should feel heroic, but it's agonizing. Lois is being crushed to death, and in her final moments, we know that she never stopped believing that Superman would save her. So here, when Superman reaches his most godlike point, controlling the mighty elements, this is when he is suddenly at his weakest. Look at this transformation on Reeves' face as he slowly hears Lois's death cries. This sequence means even more than Superman chasing the missile because this is Lois. This is personal for him and for us. And then Lois just dies. She suffocates to death. What? She dies? Yes. This is what kids' movies used to be like. I'm telling you, you guys wouldn't last a day in the asylum where they raised me.
Taylor Swift, always right.
And when Superman sees the car, this look of utter horror on his face, he is at his most godlike, but now suddenly he's at his most human. And then when Superman touches her corpse and John Williams' Lois theme plays, this is a Superman who is a human being, who feels, who is imperfect. This is a Superman who is in pain because he can save everyone except the people he loves. Then, for 2 minutes of screen time, Superman cradles Lois's corpse as Donner really lets this scene breathe. And there is this especially heartbreaking moment when he lays her to the ground that he is surprised by how lifeless her body feels. And then just nothing. Superman can't live with his failure, so he breaks the laws of the universe to reverse time and bring Lois back, which frankly should have been what freed Zod from the Phantom Zone in Part 2 because he suffers no consequences for breaking the laws of the universe in physics. But remember, this movie was hastily rewritten at the last minute because they were firing Richard Donner. It's a long story, we're not going to go into that right now. The point is, though, that we have just seen Superman at his greatest height followed by his greatest failure. So now let's take a look at these parallel 4 scenes in Man of Steel, and then I'm going to talk about how Zack Snyder's particular worldview changed this character, and why I think this is a betrayal of who Superman is. Now, I should tell you guys, I was so pumped for Man of Steel. I loved 300. I was so excited to see Snyder update this story with like more modern effects. It had a great cast, Hans Zimmer, Henry Cavill, an amazing trailer. I was just excited to see Superman on the big screen. But instead, I got an auteur movie that showed us a Superman that was filtered through how Zack Snyder sees the world. So, let's start with the scene from Clark's childhood. Now, we see kids bullying Clark, and they're like much more cruel than the kids were in 78.
Come on, fight back!
Notice here that Clark wants to use his powers to get revenge so he won't be bullied, but he has to show restraint so he doesn't hurt anyone. Now, he doesn't have to hold back so he won't score too many touchdowns. He's holding back because he can really kill someone. He is learning from a young age that he is dangerous, a walking nuclear bomb. But then, he saves a bus of his classmates from drowning, and that snitch Pete Ross sees him use his powers. Afterwards, his parents try to brush off the whole incident, but privately, Paul Kent gets his son in trouble.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
And there's a similar scene in Batman v Superman where Paul Kent tells Clark a story about saving their farm from a flood and accidentally flooding the neighbor's farm in the process. The lessons he's teaching Clark is that helping people is nice, but that doesn't mean that you should always help people.
Yeah, like there are times when you're better off letting children die on a school bus.
No, now to be fair, his dad didn't say Clark should let the kids die. He said maybe they should die, but he does try to give him some real-world perspective.
When the world finds out what you can do, it's going to change everything.
Now, just like in Superman 78, he says that Clark must have been sent here for a reason. And then he says the key line of this scene.
You're going to have to make a choice. A choice of whether to stand proud in front of the human race or not.
That's the important word here, choice. It comes up again and again in Man of Steel. Now, Jonathan is looking out for his son first and the world second. He wants his son to be happy and make a decision that will make him happy in his life. And Martha gives a similar talk to him in Dawn of Justice.
You don't owe this world a thing.
The lesson here is pretty clear. Only help people if you want to, not because you feel like you have to. Choose your own happiness over others, which violates rule number 1 of Weldon's book, Superman always puts the needs of others before himself. But the thing is, this version of Clark does want to help people all through the movie. He helps the bus of kids. He argues with his dad about how he wants to do more with his powers. He helps the oil rig workers, and Lois Lane even says,
"The only way you could disappear for good is to stop helping people altogether, and I sense that's not an option for you."
So, just like in 78, the death of his adopted father of Jonathan, sends Clark on the road. Eventually, he finds a Kryptonian spaceship, the DCEU version of the Fortress of Solitude. And, just like in 78, he meets the ghost of his father. But in this movie, Jor-El gives way more exposition to set up the climax of the movie. He explains the world engine, Zod, and then he talks about the Kryptonian breeding program. In this film, Kryptonians have been genetically modifying their people for thousands of years, and everyone is designed to fulfill a particular role in society. Now, this is not a Snyder invention. This idea of unnatural Kryptonian birth and worshipping science was created by John Byrne in the 1986 Man of Steel relaunch. But Snyder chooses to make it a major focus of his film. Superman isn't just Superman, he is the repository for all Kryptonian DNA. And most importantly, he is the embodiment of free will. Kal-El was not designed by the system. He was naturally born. Unlike every other Kryptonian, Kal-El has a choice. He can decide who he wants to be.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious. The element of choice. You were the embodiment of that belief, Cal. Krypton's first natural birth.
Now, plenty of Superman stories have centered on this idea, that Clark had to make the choice to be a hero. It's also a big part of issue 1 of Byrne's Man of Steel series, but usually Clark decides to be Superman and then we get to move on to him being Superman. But in this movie, Snyder keeps hammering away at this idea that it's Clark's choice. Clark has to decide. The decision is all Clark's. Because, after all, Clark is the embodiment of free will, but Jor-El encourages him to use his gifts to help, to guide humanity, and to give them hope.
Embodied within that hope is the fundamental belief in the potential of every person to be a force for good.
Now, I don't know if Snyder is currently a religious man, but he was raised a Christian Scientist, and some of those beliefs clearly stuck in his version of Superman.
We're the arms wide open.
And then there's this line.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. They will join you in the sun, Cal.
and then he finally flies, for real. And man, do these effects look terrible in this movie. Instead of the wide panoramas and elegance of Reeve floating through the air, the camera stays fixed on Henry Cavill's face, so we don't see the grandeur, just his reaction to this sensation. But this is fitting because, as we'll see in a second, this Superman was molded through the lens of individualism. And this is where these two movies start to diverge. The key difference between Man of Steel and Superman 78 is that after Clark embraces his heritage and flies, in Man of Steel, he still can't decide if he wants to go public and help people, because he's still haunted by the stupidest scene in the movie, when Pa Kent dies in a cartoonishly dumb tornado. After Jonathan tells his son for years that it's his choice whether or not to use his powers, he refuses to allow his son to make that choice and instead makes his son watch him die. It's a stupid scene, guys. I'm sorry, but the effects are terrible, it's poorly directed, it comes out of nowhere, and it's a big budget reinterpretation of the much more effective Pa Kent heart attack in 78. Now I know that some people like this scene for some reason. I had a tweet go viral over it. We talked about it on our Man of Steel vs. Iron Man video, but the scene is a loser. It's confusing and it does not forward the character at all, and frankly, it's the moment I checked out of the movie. But I do love Costner in this role. That scene where he tells Clark about the ship, it gets me every time.
Can I just keep pretending I'm your son?
You are my son.
Will you stop crying?
So, after Clark flies and has this flashback, he returns to his mom's house. Now, in 78, after becoming Superman, he also chooses to focus on his life as Clark Kent, moving to Metropolis and getting a job at the Daily Planet. But he does this to establish a base so he can then be Superman and help people. But in Man of Steel, he's looking backward and returns to Smallville. In 78, Superman discovers his greater cosmic purpose. But in Man of Steel, he's mostly just relieved to learn about himself. In fact, the first thing he tells his mom is that he met his other parents.
I found him.
Who?
My parents. My people.
Because in Man of Steel, Clark did not put on the suit and embrace his Kryptonian heritage to help people. He does it for himself. It makes him feel good to know where his people are from. Because, after all, everything in this movie is about choice. Clark has to decide for himself if he should now use his godlike powers to help others. So, let's look at the third scene where Superman reveals himself to the world, the companion to Superman saving Lois in 78. In the original film, once he becomes Superman, he dedicates his life to putting others before himself. In Man of Steel, he becomes Superman so he can feel good about himself.
So why did Zack Snyder create such an individualistic Superman?
Well, to understand Snyder and his Superman, we have to look at his upbringing, his worldview, and the types of stories that have influenced him. He was raised a Christian Scientist, and they believe that the physical world isn't real, or at least that it's a shadow of our true heavenly existence. Snyder once said that Christian Scientists believe that part of our journey is to transcend that reality through Christ-like living. And I think the key word there is transcend. Clark was a god, forced to live as a mortal man. Learning about his heritage means that he transcends the mortal world. One of Snyder's favorite books as a child was called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. He told the New York Times a lot of beliefs of the metaphysical aspects of that Christian science were illustrated in Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Now, this novel is about a seagull who isn't content to just fly from the sea to the shore like other gulls. He wants to be amazing at flying. So, he defies the wishes of his conservative, taciturn, traditional father and then pursues his artistic passion. So the seagull meets two other birds who take him to a higher plane of existence, a world found through the perfection of knowledge.
Next up, knowledge!
This idea that you can transcend reality through perfection is one of the tenets of Christian Science. Jonathan Livingston Seagull is about an exceptional bird who defies conformity, follows his passion, and then becomes great at what he does. And that is exactly the type of Superman that Zack Snyder created, a nonconformist who will always make his own choices, even when it appears that he should have no choice at all. When Zod arrives on Earth, he threatens to destroy the planet unless Clark, reveals himself to the world. And Clark still hesitates because he's not sure if the world is ready. After spending an entire movie telling us that everything Clark does has to be his choice, the story presents him with an existential crisis. If he does not reveal himself, then billions of people are going to die. And even then, he hesitates with this oh-so-subtle Christ in Gethsemane metaphor looming behind him. Zod's appearance is nothing more than a larger version of the dad-killing tornado. Clark could reveal himself to save lives, but even with the world at stake, Snyder insists it still has to be his choice. Now, in our Snyderverse versus MCU video, which I really highly recommend, it's one of my favorite videos we've ever done, I talked about Zack Snyder's love of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. That book and Ayn Rand extolled the virtues of objectivism, saying that man is only a heroic being if his own happiness is the moral purpose of his life. This is the polar opposite of the Superman we grew up with, who is more altruistic, puts the needs of others before himself. But through this Randian worldview, Superman can only help people because it's a choice that he makes that makes him happy. Frankly, this is a Superman whose powers are a burden to him. And that's not Superman, that's Batman. Batman does not actually want to put on the tights and fight crime. He is compelled to by the memory of his parents. Like, for instance, in The Mask of the Phantasm, when he falls in love, he begs his parents for permission to stop.
Please, I need it to be different now. I know I made a promise, but I didn't see this coming. I didn't count on being happy.
But you gotta remember, Man of Steel came out on the heels of the Dark Knight trilogy and even had Christopher Nolan attached as a producer. The studio wanted a darker Superman, something more in line with the Nolan Batman films, and what they got was a Superman who hated helping people. So after getting his suit and learning his place in the cosmos, this Superman still has to be cajoled into being a hero. Now, I'll be fair, he doesn't hesitate because he's a selfish asshole who doesn't know if he wants to help people or not. He does want to help people, but he is worried about how his presence will affect the world. However, the fact that aliens have entered the atmosphere means that it no longer matters if the people of Earth will accept an alien being like himself. What he's worried about is that the people won't accept him, that becoming Superman and helping people is going to make his life harder. So, the moment where he reveals himself to the world is when he surrenders himself because Zod has forced his hand. Or, I guess you could say he reveals himself to the wider world when he has to fight Zod on the streets of Smallville. And actually, I think it's telling that this Superman's first public act isn't saving someone's life, it's committing an act of violence. And now let's look at our final scene. The scene that made me stand up in a movie theater and yell "no" at the top of my lungs. The scene where Zack Snyder firmly said, "No guys, this is my Superman." Let's look at the Zod snap. So, after Clark turns himself over to Zod, they do not start fighting right away.
This should be cause for celebration.
Remember, Clark's main internal conflict in the movie has been that he did not know who he was or where he came from. Now, he's not only learned who he is, but he's finally met his own people. Zod tells Kal about how they journeyed the stars looking for more Kryptonians so they could save their species. And now, Zod offers Clark a choice. He can choose to save their people from extinction.
For what purpose? So that Krypton can live again.
But then, Clark sees a vision of the World Engine terraforming Earth and killing billions of people. Now, I do like how, rather than just revealing all this through dialogue, Snyder uses the mindscape of a field of skulls to give us this iconic visual.
No, Zod. I can't be a part of this.
So, this sets up a third act where the Jesus metaphor loses any subtlety at all. This time, Superman has to team up with the United States government. They take down one Kryptonian machine in the southern hemisphere while Superman tries to stop Zod from above Metropolis. Now yes, in this scene the destruction of Metropolis is intense and way too over the top. But I do like that this Superman is not able to swoop in and just stop the engine right away. He struggles against alien technology. People die. He even gets buried under rubble and only escapes just in time to save Lois. Then Zod and Kal-El are the only two surviving members of Krypton.
Look at this. Chose the humans over us.
Now, if Clark is the embodiment of choice, then Zod embodies the opposite. He was only bred for war.
I exist only to protect Krypton.
And now he will destroy all humans just to get his revenge.
You're a monster, Zod. And I'm gonna stop you.
They have a big CGI fight that frankly is kind of boring because the characters have no weight to them. I mean, they're CGI. I'm also not a big fan of movies where characters fight in the air because we have no frame of like physical reference in the real world for how people would react to being punched when they're flying. Like when one character throws another one into a building, I don't care. They're both invincible, so it doesn't matter. And I don't for a second feel like there are real people in those buildings like I did in, say, The Avengers. So then they go to space and then they land in a train station where the world's dumbest family is waiting for them. Everyone else runs away, but these idiots stay behind.
Why do they do that?
Because, Doug, they're not real people. They're props for what's about to happen next. a snap that was heard round the world. Now, this moment has spawned a litany of stupid arguments on the internet. People defend the moment saying, well, Superman had no choice. And they're right. Superman did not have a choice, because Superman is a fictional character, and everything that he does was scripted by Zack Snyder and David Goyer.
Oh, thanks for listening, Stewie.
I had no choice.
This is not a documentary. Superman killing Zod was a deliberate choice that was made by the filmmakers. So the question is, why did they make that choice? Producer Christopher Nolan told them initially that Superman shouldn't kill, and the early drafts had Zod getting sucked into the Phantom Zone with the other Kryptonians. But Snyder and Goyer said that they felt that ending was unsatisfying. Now, in the comics, Superman famously has this rule that he never kills. In his mind, if he ever lost control even once, then it's a slippery slope that would lead to him murdering people willy-nilly until he became like Homelander.
You stay the back or I'll laser you, goddammit! I'll laser every one of you!
But the Superman in Man of Steel never establishes a no-killing rule. So then why does he have this agonizing scream afterwards? Because in this movie, Superman killing is yet another way to center on the movie's central theme of choice. At a watch party, Zack Snyder said, it is also about him ending up alone. The real question is his legacy. He's choosing us. He's so hurt, he's torn a piece of himself out. Snyder went on to call this moment Superman's Kobayashi Maru, his no-win scenario. In other words, this Superman's greatest obstacle is when he can no longer choose for himself what he wants to do. For a Snyder hero, the loss of choice is simply unbearable. And that's all fine, and they've defended the snap with a lot of other reasons. But honestly, I think the real reason they had Superman kill was because Snyder and Goyer just wanted to update Superman for 2013. Goyer said, if you don't reinvent these characters, then they become stagnant and they cease being relevant. Hopefully, we've redefined Superman. The thing is, though, Superman's not supposed to be a product of his times. He defines his times. Superman is the constant. Remember the rules. He always thinks of others before himself, and he never gives up. Now, if you think that idea is too old-fashioned to anchor a movie, well, then I defer you to America's ass.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know. Steve Rogers became the inspirational hero that Cavill's Superman should have been. When we watch Chris Evans play Captain America, we don't think, oh, what a stodgy old conservative. No, we watch him and think, gee, I wish everyone could be like that. I wish I could be more like that. Now, it's not that I am against Superman killing. I actually think that Superman killing is an interesting place to go in a story, if it's done right. Now, in the comics, he once sentenced Zod and the other Kryptonians to death in accordance with Kryptonian law. But afterwards, he felt such remorse that he flew into space for a year and he grew a beard and fought in gladiator combats. Really good series of comics. But in this DCEU, Superman just goes right back to killing in the next movie. In this universe, Superman and Batman kill because, well, the filmmakers were trying to make them grounded and realistic. At a screening of his movie The Watchmen, Snyder tried to say that his take on that comic book was so groundbreaking that it changed the landscape of comic book movies forever.
Once you've lost your virginity to this movie, and then you come and say to me something about oh, my superhero wouldn't do that. I'm like, are you serious? I'm like, that's cool. But you're living in a dream world.
Yeah, it is a dream world. It's a world where a guy in tights flies around and saves people from aliens. Nothing about this version of Superman is inspirational. He doesn't lead by moral example. He doesn't help others because it's the right thing to do. He is not imbued with higher purpose. He hesitates to reveal himself to the world because he does not trust humanity. And he's right to not trust humanity because, let's face it guys, we're a bunch of assholes.
Everyone is stupid except me.
I read the comments. In fact, the comments on this video are particularly mean. If I can just be old man yelling at cloud for a second here.
Shut up!
I think the internet has created a veil of secrecy that lets us treat one another like we're not actually people.
First law of robotics, you suck.
Like people will say things online that they would never say to somebody's face.
Idris Elba is ugly. There, I said it. You.
Today, I think we're more prone to calling each other names or trying to get wins by pwning people on social media instead of having actual human empathy for one another. So this is an ass-kicking Superman who always has to be his own boss. He is basically social media come to life. Put another way, Superman 78 is the person that we wish we could be, but Man of Steel is the Superman we actually are. Now, I pointed out that the Americana Superman ideal from the 70s movie was a total fabrication. It's the lie that the character believes.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
But for me, that's the point of Superman. I don't want to see a Man of Steel that sees kindness as a duty. I want a Man of Steel that sees kindness as a reward. And I will say that this current take on Superman did not resonate with people the way that Christopher Reeve did. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think Henry Cavill is great in this role, and I would have loved to have seen him do more superhero movies. I'm not really talking about Henry Cavill's Superman here, I'm talking about Man of Steel Superman. And Man of Steel Superman has his fans. Very, 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 very vocal fans. But the DCEU never had the cultural impact of the Marvel movies or of that original Superman film. I don't think that people want to see a Superman who exists to highlight our flaws. I don't want a Superman who fears and mistrusts mankind. I want a Superman who sees the best in us. A Superman that I can follow into the light.
I just wish you could all see the Earth the way that I see it. Because when you really look at it, it's just one world.
Well guys, that's just my thoughts on Superman 78 versus Man of Steel. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts and comments. Please let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.